welcome to our third virtual meetup of this season of the WILDLABS virtual meetups. It's all about listening to the future and talking about the horizons of and innovations on the horizon for bioacoustics. And today we are joined by a fantastic panel to discuss data analytics and AI. If you've been at our previous events, I'll move through this very quickly, but just so we're all on the same page, our virtual meetup series is part of a bigger program, a project supported by the Moore Foundation called that is a Bioacoustics Horizon Scan. We are bringing the community together to have a look at where the future investments are needed. Sorry, the investments are needed to move this field forward and unlock innovation and progress for how we're using bioacoustics and conservation. We are supported by a wonderful advisory panel, so expert advisory board, which you'll see here, and the project's been led by Vanessa Reyes, who's on our team. And so if you have any questions about this project or the Horizon Scan, ping Vanessa. She is your woman and is doing an awesome job leading this project. Now, just to get us on the same page, we're in the second part of our bigger Horizon Scan approach. We're hosting these conversations to get community input, and alongside these open conversations and virtual meetups, we also have a call for Horizon Scan topics. So if you have ideas for where the field is going, the Horizon Scan topic solicitation is open right now. So we'll drop a link in the chat if you've got ideas. It's only open for, I think, another 10 more days. So we would love to get your ideas before we move into the full Horizon Scan prioritization process to get the priorities for the field from the community. Now, I think it's just helpful for us to touch base on this framework, which is the three horizon framework, as we're thinking about the future of this field. And I think it's important just to keep in mind there are three horizons we're thinking about. Like, one is the now and the kind of the transition horizon, like where it's and ideas falling in this space are kind of the developments. We know how to get there. We just need some brute force to get there. So we need a big injection of funding. We need these people talking to each other. We kind of know what's needed to unlock them, even if we don't quite know how to get those resources in place. We also want to be thinking further afield and thinking on this third horizon of like, where could we possibly be going that we don't know how to get there? And it's not just a case of just adding resource. It's the bigger, more aspirational moonshot ideas of where we could be with bioacoustics, and in terms of technology, in terms of hardware, in terms of analytics and AI, and also in terms of coordination and collaboration, and the infrastructure needed to support the field. And so today we're talking about both of the horizons in the context of data analysis and AI. This is the third event, and we'll be in this whole series. The past two events are on YouTube if you want to catch up, and next week we'll be talking really about policy integration and scientific impact, and exploring how to make the link into impact and an application in the field. So it should be a fun one to conclude. But today we're focused on data analysis and AI, and to do that, I'd love to open up the floor to our first speaker, who's Justin Kitzes, and then we'll bring other speakers on, and then at the end, we'll have a big open discussion with all speakers and with you guys in the audience. But let me hand over to you, Justin. And while you're getting your deck shared, I'm going to give a little intro, if that's okay. All right. Dr. Justin Kitzes is an assistant professor of biological sciences at the University of Pittsburgh. He leads the Kitzes Lab, where the primary focus is on measuring, understanding, and predicting the impact of human activities on biodiversity. His lab has been instrumental in developing several open source solutions and a lot of documentation around effective use of bioacoustics. Beyond his research, Justin deeply understands the importance of cross-sector collaboration to advance the field of bioacoustics, and we are so thrilled to have him as a valuable member of our advisory committee for the Horizon Scan project. And in fact, Justin is kind of the a workshop that Justin hosted a couple of years ago was where this whole series and project had its inception. So we are incredibly thankful for Justin for helping us head along this track. So we're happy to welcome you to the stage and give us the intro to this this area of interest. Justin, over to you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's great. Thanks, Steph. So it's great to be here with you all today for this virtual meetup. As Steph said, my name is Justin Kitzes. I'm now an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh, where I lead a research group focused on, you can probably guess, bioacoustics. And I'm also here, of course, as part of the advisory board supporting the Horizon Scan project. So we have a great set of speakers here today, as you know. And my goal here kicking off is simply to briefly set the stage and provide a little bit of context for our talks and discussions today on bioacoustics, data analysis, and AI. And so to start off, I want to begin with a sort of reminder of sorts that the analysis of bioacoustics data sits embedded within a larger workflow of bioacoustics research, which in our group we tend to think of as in 6 separate parts. So at the base of any bioacoustics study, you have the sensor hardware, of course, a recorder, the details of deployment of this recorder, some way of storing and managing the resulting data. These are foundational, of course, and the last 2 sessions in this series have touched on many of the details here already. Those foundations support the next steps, analyses of these recordings, which today nearly always involves the use of some form of AI, usually a machine learning approach, to sift through those audio recordings to find sounds of interest, combined with some sort of statistical model that's designed to take records of that sound of interest and use these to draw some sort of robust scientific inference. And this layer, of course, is our topic for today and the focus of all 3 of our speakers. And this in turn is going to ultimately support our ability to answer questions in ecology, conservation, wildlife biology, and in related fields, which is why this whole pipeline exists in the first place. So, and I know this whole framework idea is something that Dr. Jones is going to expand on shortly. So as we zoom into this layer on data analysis and AI, and in the spirit of the Horizon Scan project associated with this session, I wanted to just very briefly highlight, at least in my opinion, just one important idea in bioacoustics, data analysis, and AI that's on the horizon on each of 3 different timescales, which I think of as today, tomorrow, and maybe beyond tomorrow, partially overlapping with now, transition, and the future, but maybe not quite exactly the same thing. So now today, I'm sure that most of us here are aware that the most common applied goal of bioacoustics, data analysis, and AI is detecting the presence of a species in recorded audio. And the use of AI here is supervised classification, that is to find instances of a sound in field recordings that we have examples of, such as a species' unique song. Now, starting already today to go beyond species classification, we're seeing an increasing number of studies that go beyond the single sound of a species to detecting within species sounds. So this could be, for example, a type of sound, such as an aggression call or an alarm call. It could be the sound made by a particular type of individual of a species, such as a juvenile begging for food or something similar, a particular dialect associated with a population, or even the unique vocal signatures of an individual organism. So AI models to detect these within species sounds, I think, are growing in importance already, starting to provide new research ideas and avenues, and I expect that to continue into the future. But now what about tomorrow? What might be on the horizon for data analysis and AI within, let's say, the next 3 to 5 years or so? Well, I'm sure many things, but I want to highlight specifically one particular need or gap, which is to continue developing the link between the output of AI models and the statistical models that we use to analyze that data. So when we use current generations of AI to analyze audio recordings, these models, of course, can indicate confidence in whether a sound is present in several different ways. This could be a yes-no answer, a score ranging from 0 to 1, a continuous score on the real number line, or even a more complex representation, such as the multidimensional embeddings that Dr. Sethi will speak about. And while much attention rightly has gone into the development of these AI models, we've devoted less attention to developing statistical models that are designed purposefully to best draw inferences from these types of data, which can take any of these forms. They can have both false positive and false negative errors. They reflect counts of sounds rather than counts of distinct organisms. and sometimes can also be combined with human review of the same files. And I expect that we'll continue to see research that's building and expanding on well-known occupancy and mixture modeling approaches, particularly integrated models for multiple data types and simultaneous false positives and negatives, along with emerging methods for natively handling raw ML outputs. So last thing, finally, just a very brief word on maybe the longer term future of bioacoustics data analysis and AI, looking beyond towards 5 to 10 years or even a further horizon. And here, the main idea that I'd like to propose that we consider is that the bioacoustics community is not, and probably will not be, a major driver of the future of AI methods in general. Now, what do I mean by that? So, for example, as we know, convolutional neural networks are often today thought to be the best-in-class AI models for classifying wildlife sounds. Dr. Kahl will discuss this. But why is that? Is this because CNNs are in fact the globally optimal way of identifying birdsong? It's possible, but I think it's also quite likely that it's because an enormous amount of intellectual and technical effort was poured into the problem of identifying the contents of images in various benchmark data sets, and probably because Mark Zuckerberg really wants to know what's in the Facebook photo that you posted last weekend. The bioacoustics community has benefited enormously by being able to borrow these advances that were originally designed for other purposes. This has been incredible for our community. But going forward, I think this also suggests that the future of our AI models in particular are likely to be similarly driven, at least in part, by needs and goals outside of our own domain. So what does that mean in practice? Well, for example, if you had to guess right now, I'd say that means there's a decent chance that in 10 years or so, we may be doing a lot of our bioacoustics AI with large language models or their successors, querying our data interactively in real time using natural language in ways that would be very foreign to us today. Now, will this exact future come to pass? Not necessarily, but again, I think it's important for us to be forward-looking, not just within our own community, but towards developments that are occurring around us that are eventually going to find their way into our scientific workflows for bioacoustics data analysis. So I just want to say thanks again to everyone for joining today. I'm looking forward to hearing from our speakers and to our discussion to follow.
Thanks so much, Justin. I think you said that we're borrowing advances for, I'll throw to the next speaker just quickly, but like I just wanted to ask about, so you said borrowing advances from outside our sector and that will be driven by needs outside our domain. I think that's true across conservation tech, right? That's not something.
So. Yeah, if I had slightly more minutes, I would have gone into why we have the audio moth. And why do we have the audio moth? I think you could largely say it's because we have smartphones, for example.
Really?
So I think that,
I guess so. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you couldn't have had the audio moth without a smartphone first, right? Just from a hardware perspective. So yes, I think that's a fairly broad phenomenon.
Okay, and so then I think it's exactly the point that you've made. It's about seeing what's coming down the pipeline and what's driving the other needs outside our domain and being able to take the most advantage of them, right?
Exactly. So I think there's that interplay between sort of trying to consciously drive what we want from within our own discipline, but also being nimble enough to watch and borrow from what's going on outside and not losing sight of either of those.
And I think it's like the underpinning of like why it's so important for our sector to not just be looking inside for collaboration, but actually be collaborating out with the tech sector and engineers and building relationships so much more be outside of our where we are right now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you so much, Justin. I'm going to hand over, if anyone's got a question for Justin, drop them in the chat. I'm going to hand over to our second speaker, who is Stefan Kahl. Stefan, as you get yourself sorted, I'm going to give you an introduction. Dr. Stefan Kahl is a researcher at the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Chemnitz University of Technology. With a background in computer scientists, we invited him because of his great work as the lead developer of BirdNET, a leading research and citizen science platform that identifies around 3,000 bird species by sound. The platform has also been used for other taxa, expanding its potential for broader biodiversity monitoring. And we are so excited to have Stefan with us today to share his insights and discuss the critical role that open source models and tools play in scaling acoustic monitoring efforts globally. So Stefan, over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And it's really great to see that so many people are interested in AI for conservation. And I'd like to talk about how AI-powered tools can actually contribute to biodiversity conservation. And so I'm pretty sure the audience, like among the audience, everyone has seen this graphic, which, yeah, is from the paper Bending the Curve of Terrestrial Biodiversity. And I'm pretty sure everyone is aware that there is a biodiversity crisis. And yeah, we need to bend the curve. And then even the Cornell Lab, part of the mission of the Cornell Lab is contributing to bending the curve. But the thing is, there's no way that just a single institution can actually, yeah, at least even make a dent. And so I think it's paramount to just be aware that when we talk about bending the curve, we have to do it together. Like everyone has to be involved. And in order to do that, we need tools that are openly available, that are accessible. And that's what I'm going to frame my presentation around. And so the things I'd like to talk about is how we can maximize the impact, or at least how we think we can maximize the impact of open source tools for conservation, and then what we think should be done to build models for applied ecology. And by models, I mean mostly AI or machine learning models. All right, so talking about these open source tools, I'd really like to introduce what I call like the BirdNET story. Just to summarize, I think like if you're aware that so we're hosting this software tool called the BirdNET Analyzer. It's freely available on GitHub, and I believe, like among others, it's one of the most sophisticated tools to do bioacoustic analysis at large scales using AI. And it really started as a dissertation project, and it was just like, okay, there was like a single person, me, working on a model, trying to figure out how to do that using CNNs, using a vision model, as Justin mentioned. And I published it just because it was kind of like, yeah, on vogue back then in 2019 in the computer science community to publish papers with code. So it was kind of expected to publish the models and the code so that people can run it. And people actually started using it. So that was great to see. And so I kept adding new models. Published a new repository that had a few examples and a newest model. And then, oh, wow, well, people complained because that already introduced some breaking changes. People were used to the interfaces that we built with the first repository, and now we're breaking things. And that's something we hadn't anticipated. That, okay, we hear you. Let's go back. Let's implement the command line interface so people can actually develop their own processing pipelines. So that was like the initial intent. It's like, put the model somewhere and let people build their own pipelines. But as it turns out, and that's something that we needed to learn the hard way as computer scientists, is ecologists don't use CLIs, or they don't want to. And if they don't have to use command line interfaces, they will happily use something else. And that's when we started to implement a graphical user interface and add this to the analyzer, add this on top of the models. And then we kept iterating over it and adding more and more features. And then it really took off. But I think the one thing that really dramatically changed the trajectory of BirdNET and how it's been used is that we introduced a no-code environment to allow people to train their own models. And I think that was like the breakthrough invention. So thinking about bending the curve and building tools that are open source and that can contribute to biodiversity conservation, I think there are different dimensions or aspects. And as a computer scientist, and this is solely speaking from a computer science, data science perspective, you're mostly building things for developers. You publish your models, your APIs, your microservices, your documentation on GitHub, and it's like, that's the technology part, and that's what you're good at, that's what you're trained at. But there's the other side, there's scientific research that's mostly carried out by ecologists, and if you want your models to be applicable to the research everyone else is doing, you need to publish applications. You need these no-code environments so that people who don't have a formal CS background can actually use these. You need reliable services, you need frameworks that are adaptable and easy to use, and then you have to publish papers on it because ecologists rely on peer-reviewed work. And then in between, there's even more, and I think that's something that we focus on at the Kelly Sayang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics. That's engagement. You have to engage the general public because it takes everyone to bend the curve. You do this mostly through community projects. That's citizen science. These are apps like our BirdNET mobile apps, competitions that we're hosting, for instance, on Cackle, hackathons, public events, social media, and all that. And that builds on top of like the things you have to do as a computer scientist. And then even if you talk about capacity building, like educating people through dedicated curricula, educating local institutions, allowing them to carry out the research, doing that through summer schools, tutorials, videos, or classrooms. That's also part of like the story of that's part of like this holistic approach of building open source tools for biodiversity conservation. And if you're a computer scientist, that can feel a bit scary, right? Because you thought, oh man, I thought I was like deep learning engineer, and now I have to do all these other things. Now I have to think about like what ecologists need. How do I like even come up with a curriculum to teach local groups? And so that's something that plays into, and I think there's a the mindset of computer scientists that has to change if we think about building these powerful models and even more powerful models moving forward. And as Justin mentioned, right now we're relying on technology that has been established. We're using mostly vision models, but we've seen large language models that if we talk about foundation models, like the things that are at the core of everything that we do with AI, the things that can do everything, there are some considerations that we have to make, and there are some things to consider what it means like for distributed tools and public tools. And I think we can all agree on that foundation model for bioacoustics. I mean, okay, cross taxa, a broad frequency range, different inputs, like all the species, mega detector, like anything that could possibly occur, maybe even include like metadata, maybe even image, maybe even language. So like, I think there's consensus on, okay, that's what it takes, massive amounts of compute, large models, that's a foundation model. But I believe there's more to it, and there are some challenges when thinking about applying these models for ecology, for nature conservation. And so usually the process, or at least how I view it is, as a computer scientist, as an AI engineer, you start with the model development and then you open source it. So that's the story. So that's the plan at least. And usually what happens is you have the funding to do the model development, and then everyone expects to like the open sourcing to happen on the side. And that's usually what they call the last mile. It's just like, yeah, like some easy steps at the end. But I believe like thinking about all these different dimensions, thinking about APIs, services, applications, competitions, social media, tutorials, videos, there's so much more that comes after model development, which is usually underfunded. And it's usually not like the core competence of computer scientists, but that's something that has to change. And I believe AI engineers have to adapt to these requirements and maybe then even cut down on the amount of time or the resources they invest into model development. And so to wrap this up, I think there are a few considerations when thinking about building powerful models that everyone can use, building distributed tools, building tools that are open source, that are publicly available, and that actually contribute to nature conservation. And I think, and I'm always a strong advocate of this, that the most important aspect of it, that applicability beats accuracy. And I think it is okay to sacrifice some percentage points in accuracy to increase the applicability. And I just want to like briefly mention a few things that I mean when I talk about applicability. I mean, for instance, that models need to be portable. So right now, for instance, in BirdNET, it was trained in Python with TensorFlow, but there's also a JavaScript version. So we made it so that we can convert BirdNET from Python from one programming language to another, which then supports a completely different set of hardware. So you can run BirdNET in a browser, which is cool. But one of the things, it was trained in TensorFlow. Open Soundscape is in PyTorch. There's no way to convert TensorFlow model to PyTorch, at least not with BirdNET. And so like we can't support Open Soundscape, which is unfortunate. These models, I think, need to be efficient. You have to think about like dedicated hardware, like microcontrollers or like devices that are super power efficient, and they need quantized versions, which will decrease the accuracy, but will contribute to the applicability. Models need to be customizable. I mentioned these no-code environments that ecologists like to use to retrain for their target species. That's important. That needs to go into like considering what the architecture should look like. And then something that is super important is consistency. Scores need to be consistent, need to be reproducible. That's something people need to be able to go back and reproduce results. And then also thinking about the last mile, you need sustained funding. You need to update, you need to provide bug fixes, you need to troubleshoot, and that's something to consider when applying for grants and for funding. And if you're interested in how we do it with BirdNet, how we proceed, if you want to contribute to the discussion or have ideas or features that you could think of, let us know. Make sure to go to birdnet.cornell.edu. And then thanks for listening, and I'll hand it off to the next speaker. Thanks.
We're going to stay on you for just a second.
Sure.
Thank you so much. That was an awesome talk. And I just wanted to take the opportunity. I've dropped this in the chat, but when you talk about all of the funding being for model development and then this stretch of like the last mile, all of the other stuff that it takes to make it open source or usable, I think we see that again across all of conservation. And it's shocking me that it's not shocking me, but like the last 2 sessions, all of the conversation has been around funding and funding infrastructure and funding that last mile. So I wanted to flag that we have a funding opportunity through Wild Labs that came out on Monday called the Boring Fund. And the goal is to fund the boring stuff of conservation tech, which means everything in that last mile, technical debt, training, developing documentation, doing all of the stuff you've just talked about. So that funding opportunity is open. We know it's small, but we're hoping it is the start of having actual resources to this sort of foundational, like last mile stuff. But so there's a link in the chat if you're interested in that. But I actually wanted to throw you, Renata, you had such a great question. I want to actually throw to you to be able to ask that to Stefan. Would you be able to jump in? Do you have a mic? Okay, I'm going to ask Renata's question for her. She says, large amounts of data and computing power equals resources. How can we be more inclusive to allow researchers from less resourceful countries and usually more biodiverse to tap into the resources with equitability? Should we be investing in data centers and further capacity building in the global south? What do you think?
I think the best way to scale is to be mindful about the resources a model needs to be run. And that, like, even if you assume, yeah, they're going to run it in a cloud environment because they have their cloud, eventually AWS costs will eat you alive. And so that's just something that's not sustainable. And so even if you throw all the compute that you have at these models, at some point it's not going to scale very well. And so that's something we try to be mindful about, like make sure that these models run on low, like on low resource PCs or workstations, maybe even run on embedded devices like Raspberry Pis, which might even be more affordable in low resource countries. And so I still think there's a difference between training a model and then running it. Running is usually cheaper and like can be done like really quickly, and even the retraining process doesn't need a whole lot of resources. It's the big model. It's the training of the big model that is like requires a lot of resources, but we can make sure that we do have the resources to train it and then deploy it and make sure that everyone can use it independent of these resources. So I think that's the best way to scale it. I'm not sure if everyone should own a data center. I'm not a huge fan of data centers per se. I think if people have an old laptop, they should be able to run BirdNet. That's at least something we're striving for, is like they should be able to run it even on outdated or low resource hardware.
Filippo, do you have a mic?
Yes.
Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Stefan. Thank you so much for your talk. It's super interesting. I was very curious when you said that the turning point happened when you implemented a retraining feature, because I heard sometime that automatic retraining might be problematic when the users don't have experience with machine learning retraining due to the quality of annotations, the parameters set for training, the dataset split, and all of this. Do you have any insight on this issue?
So that's still true. It's still complicated, and you have to be cautious about the data and data curation. But that's usually something that ecologists are really good at. they know their data, they know their species, they have these collections, they're clean, they've went through thousands of hours manually, and they have like a nice setup. So like they usually, like ecologists, at least that's my impression, do have the data, and they're also scientists, so they know like what a good scientific practice is, that you do experiments and all. Sometimes people struggle with their mental models of what the AI does, and that's on us doing a better job in explaining what all these different settings are, and so like what these hyperparameters are. So like it's still like a complicated process to train, even though you only have to click a few buttons. I'm not sure if you can abstract this away, but that's, I think, something that has to go into the capacity building. That's what we're trying to do, is educate people on these processes, educate at least on a higher level on what the AI does and what the model sees, it's a vision model, right? And what it does, and how it works, and what it scores, what the metric is. So these things are still there, but I think one of the largest contributor to a successful model or good model is data curation in a clean, or like at least a representative data set. And that's usually something people have.
Okay, there's a lot of questions coming for you specific to BirdNet in the chat, so I'm gonna get you to jump into the chat and pick up
Sure.
some of those questions. And there's also just like a lot of like thank you for developing BirdNet and kudos. So thank you for that wonderful talk. Gave us a lot to think about. I'll bring you back for the group discussion in a second. Well, not a second, in like 20 minutes, half an hour. Right now, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Dr. Sarab Sethi leads the Interdisciplinary Ecosystem Sensing Group in the Department of Life Sciences at Imperial College London, and is also part of Imperial-X, an initiative that explores how AI can be harnessed to solve scientific challenges. His group focuses on the acoustic monitoring of natural environments, in developing cutting-edge real-time sensing systems and AI tools to extract ecological insights at scale from audio data. We've invited Sarab because of this extensive experience in managing large-scale ecoacoustic monitoring networks, and today he will talk about soundscape analysis for biodiversity monitoring, exploring acoustic indices, current limitations, and future directions in the field. I'm very much looking forward to this talk because I think it's one of those ones that's got a lot of conversation and controversy around at the moment. So I'm interested to hear what you say. So take it away.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, I guess my talk is going to be a bit more specific than the last couple, which have taken a really good overview of the field. And what I'm going to talk about is like kind of my views on soundscape monitoring, informed almost entirely by 3 papers that I'll sort of put up at the end so you can know how they string together. Yeah, and also as Stephanie mentioned, I love the sensors and stuff, so please, yeah, I'm interested in the hardware bit, but today I won't be talking about that. I'll just talk about soundscape monitoring. So I think you're all aware of this probably. I've seen in the sort of chat we're exclusively bioacoustic people in some way. But there's 2 approaches to analyzing ecoacoustic data. One is what Stefan talked about, species ID, BirdNET. You can tell whether a bird is here or there. You get occupancy data, maybe abundance if you do some special localization kind of stuff. And these are brilliant ecologically relevant outputs. Ecologists know what to do with species occurrence data or species abundance data, but building the models are difficult. Testament to sort of what Stefan and his team have taken on. They've done amazing, but they're still huge. There's 99. I think I was giving some teaching the other day, and I was like, BirdNet's incredible, the amount of species it do, but what about the other 99.7% of the species out there, that probably vocalize? And then the other approach is to look at soundscape features. So very basically like volume of an audio clip, look at the site 1, look at site 2 at the same time. Is the volume louder? Is the activity at a certain frequency band louder? Or even we can use CNN-derived features, use machine learning models to extract features. But it's the same idea. You're just getting the summary statistics of an audio file, and you're looking at how these vary across two areas or 2 files at different times a day. These are really easy to deploy at scale, but they don't really have such clear ecological interpretation. One thing we know and have known from sort of Jerome Suar's really pioneering work in this area for a long time is that soundscapes can predict ecosystem quality, and that was kind of the initial reason people started using these soundscape approaches. So here I've got 2 examples that I've shown from a paper of ours where we're predicting avian richness. So we had point counts data and we had audio recordings during the same point counts. And so someone on the floor was writing down, I've seen this bird, I've seen that, and we got species richness. In temperate forest, this was actually on in Cornell's Ithaca campus. And then on the right-hand side, in a tropical forest, we have proxy measures for habitat intactness, above ground biomass. And we used both soundscape indices, the traditional entropy type ones in blue, and CNN features to predict these different metrics of habitat quality or biodiversity quality. And, you know, they both work. The soundscape indices don't work quite so well, but they're still far, far better than chance, right? You're getting good classification accuracy from both. You're getting probably better performance, well, quite a lot better performance if you use machine learning embeddings. But okay, great. Soundscapes can predict ecosystem quality. That much is kind of agreed and has been agreed across the literature. Another interesting result from a paper we had in 2021 was that soundscapes can predict species occurrence. So here, what we did, what you're looking at here is on the y-axis are different sites across a degraded tropical forest landscape. So at the bottom, you've got old growth, and then at the top, you've got oil palm, and then there's selectively logged and logged forest in between. And so you're kind of looking at a gradient of habitat quality on the y-axis, and then hours a day on the x-axis. And in red, we know for sure whether each of these species, the yellow-vented bulbul, the sooty cat babbler, or the treehole frog, were found at these sites at these times. And in blue, we have soundscape predictions using machine learning models on soundscapes of whether that species would be there or not. So this is subtly different to species ID, right? But it's getting at the same idea. It's using the soundscape as an indicator of whether the species will be there, but not necessarily listening for the actual vocalization of the species. So you can detect non-vocal species this way, insects, you can, and when we looked in actually at what our model was picking up on, it wasn't learning to identify the vocalization of the yellow-vented bulbul, it was learning to identify general soundscape drivers that were typical of when you find a yellow-vented bulbul. So you can do this for nocturnal, diurnal species. It picks up on variations on the soundscape and gives you an estimate of habitat suitability for each of these species. What was quite nice and validating was that actually this performed better than your traditional ways to do soundscape to do habitat suitability. So ACD is above ground carbon density from flown over LiDAR sensors of the same forest. So, you know, you might say, well, why don't you just measure habitat intactness or some habitat quality using LiDAR scans, which we have for everywhere? Well, it doesn't give you quite as much predictive performance. And it's, you know, that's a useful sort of 0.1 increase in AUC. So it's meaningful, and you can pick up on areas that might seem like they have suitable habitat for a species, but actually don't this way. So yeah, soundscapes to me is to do sort of community level things, but also species level things. But a big question that's kind of flying around is like, how reliable are these predictions and how generalizable are these predictions? And so this is a study I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on. And here what we did was we got 4 point count and acoustic data sets. So in the US, Taiwan, India, and Malaysia, we had hundreds and hundreds of point counts, thousands in the US, almost 1,000 in Malaysia. Independent point counts, so someone on the ground was writing down every bird species they saw for a period of time, 10 to 20 minutes, and an audio recording that was made at the same time. So we know exactly the soundscape, and we know exactly the avian species community that was found at each of these locations, and for thousands of replicates. What we found was here we did univariate correlations of the soundscape features with avian species richness. And what we're visualizing here is the number of data sets that acoustic features correlated with avian richness on with. So, you know, all of these in the 0, that means there were about 10 soundscape features which didn't correlate with avian richness in any of the 4 data sets we looked at. And slightly fewer learned features. So learned features being the CNN machine learning derived embeddings. The key takeaway from this is that you're very likely, if you pick a random soundscape feature, to get a correlation with biodiversity in at least a data set, if you look at 4 data sets, right? Most features, either learned or soundscape, like sort of entropy-based features, correlated with biodiversity in 1 or 2 data sets. But that kind of implies that for the other 2, there was no correlation. So we're looking here at like 60 different soundscape indices and 128 different learned features. So how do you know a priori out of these, you know, 200 odd features that you can choose which one you choose to measure biodiversity? And it's quite clearly showing there's not really generalizability happening, at least on the univariate kind of approach. We also found that machine learning models didn't generalize. So, the first slide I showed you where I said soundscapes predict habitat quality or something important about ecosystem that we're monitoring. What I was showing you is if I have a training data set from India and an independent test data set from India, I get a fairly good R-squared. I can predict species richness quite well. And the same with Malaysia and the same with Taiwan. But if I train my data using the Taiwan observations and then I test that same soundscape model to predict species richness somewhere else, for example, India, Malaysia, USA, I get almost nothing. And in most cases, this cross generalization, there's no predictive power. So you can do better than this. You can do better than univariate correlations with machine learning algorithms, but you still can't do the generalization. One thing we did find is that soundscape change correlated with community change in each of these data sets. So that's something that you kind of get for free, is if you track a soundscape from point count A, and then you look at the difference in the soundscape to point count B, your species community is going to be quite different from point count A to point count B. But it's not a golden bullet, right? On this graph, you can see there's lots of clustering in this top right corner. And what that shows you are at times when the soundscapes were quite similar, there's low soundscape distance, but the species communities were very different. So massive species community turnover with almost no soundscape difference. So it's not a golden bullet. And, we only looked at avian species here. But that's kind of already showing, if the cluster were the other way, you could say, well, what about all the other species changing? But that we're finding the inverse of what you'd expect by looking at a subset of the community. And I guess the kind of soul searching thing of this graph really, which summarizes this study in a picture, it's like, do we expect soundscape models that are trained in Malaysia to predict species richness to perform when deployed in the USA? And I'd say, no, that's kind of a bit ludicrous to expect the species communities in the USA to sound the same as the ones in Malaysia, and for when they scale in diversity, for the soundscapes to change in the same way. But that is exactly what we're doing in the literature time and time again by publishing more indices with more features and saying, look, this method works, it's better than the last method, go use it in your new study. So yeah, my key takeaway is soundscape approaches are cool, they work, you can predict lots of really interesting stuff with them, especially if you use machine learning approaches combined with the soundscape approach. But this idea of soundscapes, there being some universal hallmarks of biodiverse or high quality, whatever you're measuring, soundscapes is probably a bit of an ill-posed problem from my perspective, at least with this data that we're seeing. And these are the 3 papers, so you might just want to quickly screenshot or jot them down if you're interested, and they kind of follow this story that I've presented to you today. Yeah, thanks. And please, as I said, I've launched my lab only in the last year, so do get in touch if you're looking for new collaborations. We're in a pretty good position to be opening up and engaging with large projects.
Thank you. I won't lie, you kind of went really deep for me as a kind of an expert outsider, but I think you brought it back at the end and summarized it perfectly and gave me 3 things I need to go read now. Okay, let me just check the chat. I want to ask a question that came up last meetup and in the session on data platforms and networks, and they started talking about the use of embeddings to make acoustic data sets from different networks searchable as a future goal. Do you think that's, as I understand it, which might not be correct, embeddings are possibly an improvement on indices? Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, improvement
Okay.
if all you're looking for is raw predictive power. Yes, they're more descriptive and you're likely to get better predictions of whatever training task that you're looking for. What you lose in interpretability, right? Someone might have an indice that tells you really clearly something that a biologist can come and say, this tends to work well if you have, say, recordings of one species.
Okay.
And you use an indice and you're like, oh, look, there's more variability, and that might actually tell you something about the vocal species of that one one population that are different to the vocal like mechanism of that one population compared to the vocal mechanism in another. And that's something that machine learning approaches would struggle to do, is tell you sort of insightful things about the actual audio that's being produced and potential mechanistic underpinnings. But if all you're looking for is just to use a soundscape to predict an output variable, a sort of target variable, then yeah, embeddings and machine learning approaches are probably a bit better.
Okay. Alma, do you want to ask your question? Do you have a mic?
Yep. I was just thinking that in order to train soundscape with pristine ecosystems, as we continue to degrade ecosystems, how do we go about finding somehow a baseline for what a pristine ecosystem is, so that you can have that comparison? And how would you think about, or how are you overcoming the problem that we perhaps will never know what pristine ecosystem is?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's a lot of talk, and I'm sure it's come up in different sessions, about this kind of like deluge of data problem in bioacoustics. And people are saying, which data do I need to keep? Should I just delete it? And, that my first comment is don't delete any data that you've collected. Like the value of an audio recording, especially as you say, if you got it from pristine ecosystems which are being threatened, if storing your data is too expensive, you're probably just not doing it in the most efficient way. Like these days, the amount of data that a small startup could hold in, measured in petabytes and beyond, is incredible, and the cost efficiency you can do that. So I think number one is finding ways to make sure all the data that people have already collected is archived safely and for a long time. And so how to collect more data, yeah, it's just, a question of funding, I guess. I don't think there's another way around it, and sort of the importance of, but I guess it's also, why do you want that pristine ecosystem comparison? It depends what your question is. And if you've got the right question, you should be able to justify collecting data from those places. Yeah, it's difficult for sure.
Abram, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. So in my head, like soundscape indices are this tool to kind of a low power, low cost tool to try to correlate with various ecological processes. If you had a model that could detect every species, like if we break through this ability of not being able to process these data sets and actually do this species detection, like, do we think that soundscape indices still have like a place in our research toolkit?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And, this vision of like perfect sound event detection for everything, right? Not just species, but like anthropophony, geophony. No, I don't think you do need soundscape models at the end, right? Because what you can do is you can go back and recreate those indices from the fundamental knowledge. How likely we are to reach that in, decades. And to be honest, at a point where most sites, when we're going into tropical forests especially, we like ecologists, taxonomists don't even know what the species are, let alone having the training sets to train a model and stuff. So yeah, I agree that in a perfect world, we don't need it. I would add the one caveat that there is this really interesting field of perceptual ecoacoustic soundscapes, right? Like as a human, how does this soundscape influence me or my enjoyment of this environment or my engagement with nature in this setting? And there, I think these summary statistics of how the soundscape comes together as a whole are actually more directly to the point of what you're trying to measure. You're conserving the soundscape as an emergent property rather than the species underlying it. And there, I think that there's an interesting route for soundscapes that it stands alone from species detection.
Okay, interesting. Okay, thank you so much, Sarab. I'm going to bring you back in the discussion and move on to our final speaker now. And I think there's a lot of questions for you in the chat, so go have fun. Kate, I'm going to bring you up now to round out the talks. And while you get sorted, I'm going to give you a lovely intro. And also, it's just been so cool seeing so many of your students in the chat as well, which is who are joining the masters in the next few weeks. So welcome to all of those new students. Dr. Kate Jones is a professor of ecology and biodiversity and the director of the People and Nature Lab at University College London. As an ecologist with a deep interest in the links between environmental and human health, Kate has pioneered the use of AI, sensor technology, and citizen science to study how ecosystems are adapting to change. She has extensive experience working across diverse biomes, including savannas, tropical forests, dry forests, and coral reefs. We are so pleased to have Kate with us today to guide us through developing end-to-end bioacoustic solutions that empower decision makers in conservation and environmental management.
Wow, thank you for that introduction. And what a pleasure it is to be here and to be amongst all these amazing speakers as well and colleagues and this amazing chat, which is just crazy. So crazy in a good way, and enthusiasm, lots of enthusiasm. So yeah, so thanks very much for the introduction and the invitation. So this is a kind of bit of a down over my brain, what I've been thinking about over the last few months, year or so, thinking about full stack bioacoustics, and it kind of overlaps with some of the things that Justin was saying before, and hopefully takes it on a bit in more detail with more specific examples. So what do I mean by full stack bioacoustics? And before I get started, I just want to say thank you to my PhD students and amazing colleagues, and also to Ord, who did most of the infographics. So if you like those, then talk to Ord. I just ripped them off basically from her. So just bear that in mind as you're going through. Okay, so what do I mean by full stack bioacoustics? So full stack is a kind of computational term, which means kind of end-to-end processing. But I guess I mean it in a slightly different way. And that is having kind of stakeholder engagement, or the applied question, the question you want to ask at the very beginning of this process, collecting and designing your surveys with that in mind, processing those data, managing it, uploading the data, and then having this ecological insight, and then an action at the end, or a policy decision. And I guess that's what I mean by full stack bioacoustics. And I struggle to think of any examples in the world that have done that successfully. So I would challenge you to think about how we can do this better. Or maybe you've got some examples that you'd like to share. But I'm going to go through some of the things I've been thinking about. Okay, so I'm struggling with my computer now. I'm not sure why. Okay, so this is the way most of us do bioacoustics monitoring. We put stuff out, we collect some data, we transfer the data, we manage the data, panic about how much we have, and then we process it. And at some point later on, we produce some kind of insight and publish a paper, and may or may never get to have an actual policy change. So what are the problems? There are lots of problems with storage capacity and battery capacity in the field. A lot of this is all manual. It's data management is error prone. You need trained statistician, ecologists, often to do the data processing, often with proprietary software. There's a massive time lag between actually getting the results, doing the analysis, and then producing the actual thing. And then the link to policy is even harder. So the question, I guess, is from this kind of session is about how AI could enhance this full stack process. And of course, we've been talking just now about how AI is a massive game changer in thinking about data processing, but also maybe in data acquisition too. And I'll talk about that just in a second. But as we go through this, it'd be interesting to see how we can think about how AI could help with modeling and inference, and also communication, and maybe pulling all the stack together. So one of the examples I wanted to show you was using AI for that middle bit, that processing bit. And this is a study we've been involved with, feels like forever, but maybe only 2018. So we've been working with the Bat Conservation Trust for many years, and we developed the audio moth with Alex Rogers to extend the range to bats. So that's why you can use it for bats now because of this project. We extended that range with Alex, and then we've been developing these pipelines where the Bat Conservation Trust can get an audio moth, give that to a volunteer. They record the sample that the Bat Conservation Trust wants them to in their area. They upload that, and then there's some magic AI that happens, and then the BCT works on the results and produces a policy brief for the government about the trends in bat populations. Now that's incredibly difficult, and we've been working on this for a while now. We did this bit here in the middle, this red bit, which is this AI pipeline. So the Bat Conservation Trust volunteers can send, post, or upload their recordings to Bat Conservation Trust, and then the pipeline, the AI that we've developed called Bat Detect, goes through to species classification for the UK, and then these data then go into these national statistics, and that's still, we started that a long time ago, and it's still not completely finished. So it's an incredibly difficult process to get that kind of full stack thing happening. The other issue really is new tech, and thinking about how can new sensors enhance this process. And this is something that some of my PhD students have been working on for the last couple of 6 months or so, thinking about how could you put all of these steps onto one device. So in a better way. So, we have these units deployed: data collection, data processing, data management, data transfer. They're all separate steps usually, but can we just put them onto one single board and then transfer that information, which maybe speed up that ecological insight? So that was the kind of thinking about this, and we've gotten much further on this process in the last few months, but we started thinking about this in about 2018 or so, thinking about how we could actually do it with edge processing in the Olympic Park, where the new campus that we've built is, and the new centre is. So we've got 15 of these. We built 15 of these on Edison chips, so it was quite a while ago. And we have this Bat Detect algorithm operating onto these chips, which give you real-time information about bat detections in the park. So that's been really fun, and been fun to kind of think about how to do this and how to keep those sensors powered over the last 6 years, 7 years or so. And some of the really interesting results from that are quite mind-blowing. So this is the park here. There's a massive Olympic stadium here, and these are the sensors in red. And this is a model of just showing you some of the species which we found. So this is just pipistrelle bats, genus Pipistrellus. And this is just a kind of a graph to show how important each variable is in terms of the activity of those calls. So all the processing happens on the chip, and then just sends us back the observation. So it shows that, there are more bats when it's hot. That's not a Nature paper, but when it's windy, they're not active. But this is really interesting. So when there's a stadium event, they are very decreased in their activity, and it still persists a day after the event as well. So they're really, really impacted by the noise and the light in these situations. So it has been really interesting seeing how you can tell, using these devices and leaving them out, the kind of information you can get. There were 8 million observations since 2017, and I just could not store that much data. So Sarab and I slightly disagree on that point, but we don't keep the data. The observations are sent to us using this algorithm. Okay, so then this is what we've been kind of working on recently is okay, these Edison chips are now defunct. Raspberry Pis have kind of taken over that space, or there's lots more models than that, but Raspberry Pis seem quite a good platform for doing this. And we've been trying to figure out, well, okay, there are loads of models like BirdNET and Bat Detect. How can we kind of develop a pipeline which is really useful for ecologists to kind of just download onto their Pi and then just tweak the settings and the connection settings? And so it's kind of ready to go, so they can download the package and then set up their Raspberry Pi ready for whatever they want. And it's agnostic in terms of the timings and the model that you put on. So we just tested some of the real world performance of this a couple of weeks ago, and just showing you that this is like what you would normally do with a sensor. You just upload the raw recordings and then get an algorithm to do it in the cloud. It's 51 gigabytes. And then if you do it just on the edge and just upload the actual recordings that you've detected, it's much less data. And then if you just do the observations, it's tiny. And so these are kind of much more sustainable, I would say. But there are also disadvantages, as Sarab was talking about, and the fact that you're wedded to one particular detection algorithm here, and if it changes, then you're changing your observations again. So this is stuff by two of my PhD students, amazing PhD students, Ord and Santiago. So please talk to them if you're interested in that. Okay, so just to finish then, you know, we've talked about this data acquisition, edge processing, talked about the data processing in the cloud with AI, and that they have really been a game changer. But, you know, thinking about how could we do AI to help with model inference, and how can we merge those steps? There's recently a paper on climate change modeling where they used AI to really cut down on the kind of mechanistic modeling that they were doing in climate modeling, and it cut the processing time of that model down by like 80% or something. So like cutting down on the processes that go on, and maybe we could think about how AI could be helping in that model inference. And then finally, just thinking about, you know, things like semantic kernels. They're kind of frameworks where you plug in AI agents like large language models, for example, to go and do some of this stuff. So you could have a semantic kernel, say, that had a language model, and you said to one of the language models, go and do the data acquisition, go and do the data processing, and then after you've done the data processing, come back and do the presentation, do an occupancy model for me, and then you come back, and then you type in how many bats did you see today, and it come back with 5. And, you know, so how can you use these kind of processes to help us understand how to get this full stack processes? So if you're a policymaker, or you're running the park, or you're at BCT, it can really help bring all of this together. Thanks very much.
Okay, can I ask you a question for everyone? What can you dropped in semantic kernels there at the end? Can you give it like a just a quick intro of like a summary of what it is?
I would say, in simple terms, it's a framework. So it's just a kind of frame. It's like a kind of a framework where you've got someone to help you. You've got an idea of how to run a house, and you've got a housekeeper. Like, you live in the Victorian era here, and you've got a housekeeper, and you say to the housekeeper, I want you to send someone to go shopping and bring back all the food. And then the housekeeper says to the cook, I want you to do all the cooking and produce and do a massive pavlova. And then you say to the other, you know, another kind of AI agent, I want you to invite everyone to the party. And then you want to say to another one, I want you to do the cocktails. And then at the end you say, oh, can you provide the end entertainment? And then all you then do to the housekeeper is then say, plan a party, and a party happens. So it's kind of like that framework, and these kind of people you replace with AI agents, like a large language model, to go and you train it to do that task and come back. So it kind of brings all of these things together into one framework, which I think is just mind-blowing. And we've been playing with that in another part of my research lab, which is about predicting disease emergence. So you can use this kind of framework to go and do that model, come back, do the presentation, do that, and then get you as the user to interface with it in a much more simple way.
Okay.
I hope you followed my housekeeping,
Yeah, I think so.
Housekeeping analogy.
I like that Matt said that I like the sound of Kate's party, so I think that's what our takeaway was from.
I think the cocktails are an essential component.
I think agreed. I think there's quite a few things that you touched on in your talk that I'd like to bring the whole panel in to discuss, and that have been coming up in the chat. And I think one of the major areas that you've been working on as well is capacity building and how to develop the capacity of ecologists and whoever's working with ML and analytics in the field. And so I actually wanted to throw it to Carla to ask her question first. Carla, you dropped a big, juicy, big, like meaty question for us to discuss into the chat. Do you want to throw it into the conversation? Hi. Oh,
hi everyone. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
I'm just like lost in the chat and with all the questions. So, well, basically my question, like I have been seeing this in the field where people are interested on like using bioacoustic, but then they're kind of like afraid of, you know, like having the equipment, deploying it, and what I'm going to do with the data, you know, like it seems like they feel like, or they need like a constant training and monitoring. So my question is like, besides training and capacity building, like what else do you think it's needed in order to connect with local stakeholders so they can continue and support bioacoustic efforts? I think they can be a great ally. So, yeah.
I think what you said was to ensure they both use and contribute to the development and refinement of these tools, especially in addressing the critical last mile. I thought you like nailed that question. Who'd like to have the first crack at it? Who's looking twitchy? Kate. Do you want to?
That's a really important question, and I think there is a huge role for local knowledge and you know, engagement in these projects. And I'll maybe give you an example from a coral acoustics thing that we're doing. So one of my PhD students is Ben Williams, is working on coral acoustics and working with DeepMind to produce interfaces, which means that you can use these foundation models, but then cluster those similar recordings together and then produce those and show those to the stakeholders, who are then actually just using, you know, can listen and hear their local wildlife, and then ask them to kind of label those and understand if they're grouped together. And this is really critical, because if you think you don't know anything about a tropical rainforest and what the animals are and what the animal sounds are, we know virtually nothing about what species are making sounds in coral reef. So I think that kind of interface is a really an interesting way to really, not just in a token way, but to really embed some of those local communities in that process.
Any other panelists want to jump in and add anything?
Yeah, maybe I can just say a few words on. I'm a big fan of citizen science and the community taking on, putting up sensors in their backyard, contributing to community projects, and it is, for now, at least if you look at the maps of bird weather that lists all the BirdNET pies and the BirdNet box and all, and even haiku box and all, it's still like a northern hemisphere, western high resource country thing. But I think this is something that appeals to many, and being able to contribute to these things, and for us providing devices that can easily be set up. And I think there's some, like, like if people get started with these and then like start using it and they build a community, that's a powerful thing. And through these computer science projects, even though like the data like these computer science projects produce are not necessarily like super great for actual research, it's still like a powerful thing to just see there's more people doing that. There people are interested in like being part of this community, contributing, like at least having a sense that what I'm doing in my backyard actually contributes to the greater goal, contributes to training new models, just that feeling. And I think that's something that local communities can do, should do, but I guess probably it's again on us to build the tools that everyone can use. But I think citizen science is a great way to be more inclusive.
Agreed. Oh, yeah.
I could just add, like, so I completely agree with all that's been said, but I mean, the particular point of Carla's method of including others in development of the tools, you know, like we're working with scientists in India, and like yes, the budgets for massive AWS instances aren't there because of income disparities or, you know, purchasing power disparities. But the engineering technical talent is beyond what I've seen a lot of the like UK research sort of, or, you know, community. So like, I think basing development of tools and, you know, tapping into that talent and engaging with it in a real, like, you know, equal research collaborators way. You know, there are certainly areas of the world where there isn't research going on, but that people are doing capacity building and outreach. You know, we work with Malaysia with some unbelievable ecologists and have done for a long time at the SAFE project. So in their own right. And so I think this view of like making usable tools is 100% necessary, right? Both to engage non-technical users in like the UK and US, but also non-technical users around the world, but also not dumbing it down and saying, you know, we can actually engage technical specialists around the world who are sitting there and just waiting to engage with problems like this. So, yeah.
And just to add, like they're also integral to the problem setting. So like, you know, asking them like, is a co-development between them and the skills that you have. So they've got knowledge of the system, they know what kind of questions are that they need to be answering for local policy or local land management, and you're kind of co-developing and co-assisting each other. So I think that's really critical when you go into a project, is having that.
I'm going to move us on, and Justin, I'm going to throw to you first. There's been a lot of conversation in the chat about edge ML and edge processing. And I think Matt, you just asked a question that I'm going to follow on with. Matt, do you want to jump in and ask your question relevant to that?
Sure, I can do. So I did see all that discussion, as you said, about, you know, edge ML and on-device detection. And I just wondered how big of a deal it was. I mean, it's a question to the broader community for real-time analysis and detection and reporting those back, rather than using a simple, you know, cut down low power approach where you're just recording the audio. SD cards have pretty huge capacities these days, so you can get at least a month's audio recorded, and then you could bring that stuff back and record and do the detection on a more powerful PC when you're back at home, and just do it in bulk.
So I'm going to add a layer onto this. If you're so how important is real-time processing? And if we do need widely adopted real-time acoustic monitoring systems, what are the key technical and logistical challenges needed to address them? That's a really big multi-part question, but Justin, do you want to have a go? And Carly, I see your hand up. I'll throw to you in a second.
Yeah. So you guessed correctly, Steph, that I have a lot to say about that, but I'm going to try to be brief. So I mean, so first question, I think it is important to separate a little bit the sort of edge from the real time, because there are a couple potential applications of edge computing that are not quite the same as real time. So I think for edge, you know, one possibility is that you want to do real time alerts, right? So we'll talk about that in a second, but we shouldn't forget that sometimes it can be a storage issue if you're leaving things for a long time and recording in the ultrasound in particular. So SD cards are big, but if you're recording bats, they're not that big, really. So it does depend a little bit on the use case. There's also this question of whether people want to offload the processing to the device because they don't feel capable of doing it themselves. So I'm sure a lot of people on this call feel like they could download data and run BirdNET on it, but that doesn't apply to all users, right? And so there's also a role for edge computing potentially in offloading that level of thinking for applications, right? So that's what I would say about edge. I think for real time, I've had a lot of conversations with folks. I think that it's interesting because I find real time bioacoustics to be one of those things that computer scientists are very excited about, and ecologists have a little bit of a hard time defining use cases for. That's my opinion. There are 3 use cases that I think seem decently compelling, and we're probably going to do a workshop soon on this, so I've been thinking about this a lot lately. There are 3 use cases I think that come up repeatedly. The obvious one is threat detection. So, poaching, gunshot, chainsaw, things like that. That's kind of an obvious real-time case, right? I think there's a related but slightly less obvious one, which is if you're trying to do data collection, let's say for a rare species, and you actually want to send a human into the field where you detect a specific animal, let's say, because you want to do follow-up, you want to trap them, you want to draw a blood sample, something like that. So that would be a second one. And then the third one that comes up is a situation where you don't just have an acoustic recorder out there, but let's say you have a multimodal sensor device of some kind, something a little bit more complicated, something a little more expensive, and you actually may want to reconfigure what your sensors are doing depending on what's going on with the biodiversity in the area at that point, right? You may want to, for example, change the sampling frequency, right? You may even potentially want to reorient the microphone, right? You may want to reorient the microphone with a video camera, for example. So those are the 3 things that I've heard come up more than once. Again, I do think it's a case where those use cases are underexplored. And I think that the interesting question for us as a community is whether there actually aren't really that compelling use cases for real time, except in sort of narrow instances with specific needs, or whether we just haven't thought it through yet because we haven't had these devices to play with for long enough in large enough volumes that we've really explored the space of what kinds of ecology and conservation questions we might be able to answer if we had access to those devices. There's my answer.
Any of the other panelists like to add on? Yeah, go Kate.
Yeah, I think that was a really great answer. I think, some of the things about behavior are also really interesting for real time. We've been working on elephant sounds in terms of how it reacts to, it corresponds to their behavior and their well-being. So something like that would be interesting because that would be a way to understand how your populations are doing. And also that there's lots of examples in the marine world where, it's, you're trying to avoid ship strike, for example, and you would need to know where those whales are, for example, in the different bays. And I guess the other thing about edge processing, and I think Justin was really right to separate those 2, real time and edge out, is some things are really inaccessible. So we often work with agencies which are working on roads and networks that are complete, it's to stop that network, to shut down the railway, to retrieve the device is often not possible or very expensive. And so inaccessible sites are very good for that kind of edge processing situation. So yeah, and the other thing was the big things which are stopping that development are battery power, having that interface with some kind of solar panel, and especially because the edge devices are much more data hungry, and connectivity in some places aren't very well connected, but you have much less to transmit if you've done it on the device.
All right, Sarab, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I might just quickly add the point on cost. When we deployed a monitoring network in Norway, I think I remember that a field assistant for a day cost about £1,500, or thereabouts. So if you're spending £1,000 on a real-time device, but then you save on like monthly £1,500 to go pick up your thing, it's just a, whether you need the real-time data or not, it's just an economic decision. So
I'd love to ask a final question for discussion around multimodal ML before giving you guys the chance to share your final thoughts. Because I think this is an area of conversation I'm hearing a lot about in the area of innovation, particularly with ML. And so with the increasing deployment of both camera traps and audio recorders in wildlife monitoring, what do you think multimodal ML what role do you think multimodal ML could play in combining different data sets to improve wildlife monitoring? Ooh.
I think it's massive. It's going to be massive, right? And not just camera traps, but like LiDAR, language models. Using the language and vision tags to train your model. So I had a conversation today about using a language model to train a bioacoustics bat model. So because they've got labels on them on Xenocanto, so trying to extract the labels and the sound and using that to train. So I think there's massive opportunities to do that, and I think that's where it's going. What
do you think the current limitations and bottlenecks are stopping progression in that front?
I think, well, I'm sure lots of the other panels will have ideas, but I think maybe having these gold standard data sets and labels and like annotations are the really big things. The models are, very powerful, and we can use and get a lot of the kind of power from these foundational models. And I think it's that fine tuning that's really important. And so those annotations, I think, are really, really important. That's the bottleneck.
Does everyone agree? Disagree?
No, I absolutely agree. Yeah. So I'm thinking even not just maybe combining audio and image, but just like a temperature sensor with meter or air quality sensor or light sensor to put some reasoning behind the detection and say, hey, it's not nighttime, that can't be an owl, or it's too windy, I'm just going to stop recording, I can't hear anything anyways. So kind of these things to improve overall detection quality, that could be super helpful. We tried this with BirdNET a while back, incorporating a location and time into the predictions, of get an embedding for location, get an embedding for audio, and then combining these. But that introduced some biases. So we struggled with that, because if you're in Germany, the blackbirds are super common. And so by default, if there's nothing in the audio, but you're in Germany, like predicting blackbird is pretty good for a model. Like that's a good guess, right? And so that biases. So we took this out and made it optional because it introduced some biases. And that's something that we struggled with. And maybe that's even something that is hard to kind of balance these different inputs on how to weigh how they contribute to prediction. That might be one of the bottlenecks.
Okay, Carly, I'm not going to call on you. I don't have time. You can have a question in the after hours. I'm going to try and wrap up on time today. We'll see. So I'm going to move to our final question. I want to give everyone the chance to think ahead and have your final thoughts. And so my question is, looking ahead, what do you think the most promising frontiers in AI for biodiversity are? And who's going to take it first? Sarab, do you want to have first crack at it?
God.
Anyone else feel more prepared?
Well, okay, I mean, just without thinking extremely deeply about it, I think tools such as what Stefan are creating are huge, generalizable tools, something that, we can pour a bunch of effort into curating a data set, optimizing a model. Maybe we spend somewhere £100,000 on a hyperparameter search for 10 models, and with every data set that we can get from the whole community together. But if we then get a model that is very cheaply retrainable and works well in a lot of places, I think that's probably, how you started with Frontier 1 or 2, probably Frontier 1.5, right? Is somewhere about that sweet spot. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Kate, do you want to go next?
Gosh, well, I agree with Sarab, totally. But I've been obsessed with semantic kernels for a while now. You know, I'm just like, this could actually replace me. I don't maybe don't need to come into work, and I can retire to my cottage in Stroud, my fantasy cottage in Stroud or something. Like, I really do think some of these kind of AI statisticians are, you know, if we could train them to do Bayesian spatial models, to run those occupancy models, to run the ML, to bring it all together, isn't that what I do? Isn't that what we do as scientists, is pull those questions together? And I think using those LLMs as a tool into the data and the stats, I think is super exciting.
Okay, awesome. Stefan.
I think one of the great upsides of AI is that it lets us ask different questions. So it doesn't just help us to speed up our processes and scale and all these things and maybe even replace, but so that's something that I usually hear from ecologists, like the skepticism of, I mean, yeah, we're doing this and that, and we're pretty reliable. We have like a process. So how can AI help? Like, no, like AI might not be the best fit for you to answer your specific question you have right now, but maybe then if you think about other questions, but other things that you never dared to ask, like maybe then AI comes in and you can actually, yeah, like look at things differently. And I think that is like a huge potential aside from all of the other upsides, of course, like, yeah, speeding up things, being more reliable, approachable, and all these things. And even adding on top of that, I always say like working with birds is really great because people always tend to have a relationship with birds, and birds have a lobby, and it's really great to see. And I think people are genuinely interested in AI too. And so they might not care about biodiversity and environmental protection, but they might be interested in AI and how it works and what it does. And it's so futuristic and it's so techy. So maybe that's another way to get people into nature conservation through AI, just because they're interested in AI. Might be something. Yeah, these are my thoughts.
Wonderful. Justin, do you want to wrap up for us?
Well,
No
yeah, well,
pressure.
I get the benefit of having had the longest amount of time to think about this, all of 3 or 4 minutes.
pressure.
So, you know, yeah. Well, I'm going to build off, I think, something that Kate said, and thinking a little bit bigger about sort of this question of AI and, you know, science in general, or scientific research or conservation research or something like that. And this kind of question of what's the relationship between humans and AI, human scientists and AI going forward. And I think that, you know, I think Kate gave the, I don't know if it's optimistic or pessimistic, depends on whether you want to retire or not. Maybe I'm not old enough to retire. I can't get in this headspace yet. You know, but, you know, there is, I think, a next step where you have AI starting to take on some of the functions that human scientists would have normally done, you know. Look for patterns in this data, run a statistical model for me, organize these thoughts, summarize these papers, right? And I think, you know, if you go to that step, it's easy to see ways in which I think human scientists become less important, because a lot of those tasks that we do now becomes taken over. But I think that there is a step beyond that, or I like to think there's a step beyond that, that actually in a way makes human researchers more important and more powerful, even if I could use that word, which is when you get to the point that you have AI models that you can engage with the way we engage with collaborators or colleagues, right? So this would be models that can ingest, let's say, large amounts of data in a natural language framework or not, but let's say make suggestions or hypotheses or propose directions or questions that seem like they might be interesting based on what we're seeing in the data that we have available and ingested and everything like that. But then it becomes the question for the scientists to say, do I follow up on this? How do I follow up on this? Okay, I followed up on it and I found X. What do you think of that? What do you think we should do now, right? And so I think there's this big kind of question or hope that you could get to the point where you're interacting with AI the way that you interact with a colleague, basically. And it becomes a back and forth, a process of sort of mutual improvement where you bounce ideas off each other. And through that kind of collaboration, you actually, like I said, become more powerful somehow. You actually achieve more through that collaboration than you would by yourself. The same way that we're used to this happening with people, right? Of course, we do this all the time with each other, but can we augment that by doing some of that with AI models? That's sort of my longer term, bigger question for the future of where it's going with AI and science. Big question. All right. Thank you for a wonderful discussion, everyone. The chat was fantastic today.
The chat, it's like a separate whole thing going on in the chat. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's what it's normally like. But I think it was particularly in depth today. But a big thank you to all of our speakers, all of you for coming along and having just such an interesting open conversation about analytics and AI and bioacoustics. We have one more session left. We're getting into impact and the bridge between the AI, the bioacoustics work and policy. And so join us next week for our final event. And also, Talia's just linked to the Horizon Scan call where you can input your ideas. I know there are a lot of people in this call with lots of great ideas. I have seen the chat. So can you please go to the Horizon Scan link and input your brilliant ideas so we can have an awesome discussion about where the future directions of bioacoustics. With that, it is time to wrap this session today. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week. Bye. Thank you.